Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
and Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Ashley.
hello.
So, guys, if you were listening to this on our podcast audio only, just to let you know that this is a special episode, which means we are actually video recording it. And if you would like to watch the video, you can go over to YouTube and see it, or you can just continue to listen either way. But what we are doing this week is very special. You may remember, if you've heard last week's episode, I told you that my friend Christy recommended the topic of the murder mansion, which is a place where a double murder occurred back in 1948 in Bowling Green. And through the course of starting to research that, we realized that this book, The Cemetery Road Murders, The Shocking True Tale of Kentucky's Murder Mansion, had been written by Mr. Wes Swietek. And so we reached out to him and he agreed to talk with us. And that is what's happening today. We are getting ready to head into this interview right now. We cannot wait to talk to him. So just as a reminder, you might want to hit pause, go back and listen to the first episode first, because that's where we tell you all about the case. Although we stop kind of at a cliffhanger moment, there's more to come.
We give our opinions at the end. We say where we're standing and what we're looking forward to. Mm-hmm. So we'll see in our interview if some of the thoughts that we had were correct or what we were wrong about.
Right. Listen to that first and then come back and join us, because we are about to head into this interview to talk with Wes Swietek.
Let's do it.
All right, guys. So we are here with Wes now. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to talk with you about this book. I'm telling you, fascinated. We are fascinated with this story and cannot wait to discuss it with you.
Glad to be here.
I read it in one day. I turned it over quick. But we want to hop right into our questions because we know your time is limited today. Based on our episode last week, our listeners now know you as the author of The Cemetery Road Murders, The Shocking True Tale of Kentucky's Murder Mansion. Candy's holding it up there. Can you share with us a little bit of your background and what led you to write this book?
Sure. Well, I've been a newspaper journalist pretty much my whole life. Grew up in Chicago, actually, and then I've been worked in newspapers around the country as a managing editor mostly. And that eventually took me to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and I'm the managing editor of the newspaper there, the Daily News. And several years ago, I guess it was probably about 2020, I was reading a online article about a famous house here in Bowling Green that everyone knows as Murder Mansion. And the house is known as that because of an infamous murder that happened in 1948. But the article I was reading was actually about an auction that was being held. The house was being sold, and this was in the 80s. And hundreds of people turned out for the auction of this house. And it's not because people thought they could buy it, because it was going to be a very expensive house, but they wanted to see the scene of the crime, the literal scene of the crime, because of this famous 1948 murder, double murder, actually, that took place there. And so when I was reading this article, and it was like, well, I'm not from Bowling Green originally, but I actually live near Murder Mansion. And so I was like, I'd like to know more about the story, like what happened, what were the murders, and things like that. So I began doing research, and I eventually decided to do a 3-part newspaper series in the Bowling Green Daily News about the murders and what had really happened there, because there was at that point a lot of mysteries about what was going on. And so we, in the spring of 2020, wrote a 3-part series again in the Daily News, and it was incredibly well received. You know, tens of thousands of views, people from all over the country saying, oh, I used to live in Bowling Green, I heard about it, or my uncle told me about it, things like that. Or I went to Western and, I'd love to know more about it. And, so it was very well received, and we're able to find some new information about the case. and eventually, what happened in the long term as well as in the actual crime itself. So the series was just so well received. Again, just I can't even count the number of phone calls and letters and emails and things like that. So it's like, well, people always say, well, you should write a book, and that's usually a bad idea for a lot of reasons, but sometimes it's a good idea to write a book about it. And so in this case, there was a lot more information that I was able to garner, and so I was like, well, I could make a 6,000 word newspaper series into a 60,000 word book. So began doing the research, found a publisher. Acclaim Publishing is the publisher of the book. The rest is, I guess, as they say, history. That's how the book came about.
That's cool. So before you learned the real story about it, can you tell us some of the most popular or outlandish rumors about the murder house?
Oh, right. People had no idea. They just knew that there was a double murder there, or a murder, or an axe killer. They didn't really know. They just knew it was Murder Mansion because there was a murder there. And the house sat empty for several years in the '60s, '50s, and '60s, and it was kind of on that point the outskirts of Bowling Green. Right now, it's kind of smack dab in the middle of the city. But as it sat vacant, like a lot of the kids who grew up in Bowling Green, they would, when they were teenagers, they would dare them to go into the house and go see, it was haunted and there was blood stains on the wall, and people would run in and they would hear a sound and they would run out because, the ghosts are going to get you and whatnot. So there wasn't a whole lot of factual information in terms of most people's recollection of what happened because it had happened so long ago. Even when you're talking about 2000, it was a 50-year-old crime. People didn't really know, like if there was a mention in an article about something, it would usually just say a Western student had killed the two owners of the house, and that was basically it. So it was a well-known house. Everyone knows the house, even if they don't know it's called Murder Mansion or anything about it, because it's just very interesting. This beautiful, beautiful mansion, and it looks the same pretty much now as it did in the 1800s when it was built. It's sitting in the middle of on a very busy road, Cemetery Road, and it's surrounded by these little houses, like just little ranch houses, and all of a sudden here's this 8,000 square foot mansion in the middle. So people, even if they didn't know it was a Murder Mansion or didn't know, the story behind it, a lot of people would say, "What's the story with that house that's on Cemetery Road? That's in the middle." You would, if you're driving down through, the deep South and saw this house, it would not, as a plantation house, it would fit in perfectly. It's a big, beautiful house, and so there's, again, even if they didn't, there wasn't a lot of information about the actual case, but there was a lot of interest in the house and sort of the background of it.
That is so funny because my friend Christy is the one who recommended the idea for this story. She grew up in the neighborhood behind Murder Mansion, and she shared exactly what you just described. She was one of those kids who would ding dong ditch the house and thought she'd heard all those rumors of terrible things that happened. And she is very excited about this episode and to read your book and to find out the true story. But that leads us directly into the next question. You got to go inside the house. As you were doing this research, the current owners at the time invited you to take a tour. Is that right?
Yes, I wound up becoming good friends with the owners, who they're the ones who actually bought the house at the auction. And the house has had, after all this happened, his house has had now 4 owners, but the 3 owners when the book was written. And I got to know Norm Johnson and Jimmy Lou Johnson, his wife, owned the house and restored it and maintained it, and very generous with their time and with sharing their house essentially. And so I got to know Norm very well. So I've been at that house, I don't know how many times. I've been at that house quite a bit, which is very interesting to be able to go into it. It just recently actually sold at auction again. To a new owner. He's actually somebody fairly well known in the community as well. He's a former state representative here and so forth. So I haven't talked to him about coming back to the house, but yeah, I've been in it quite a few times. And the Johnsons, who were the owners, they're very tied into Western, the university, and so they've had a lot of functions and very generous again with the house. So they've had like book clubs and book signings and things associated with my book, events there at the house. And so yeah, a lot of people have been able to get into the house. It's a pretty interesting place.
Well, just as a follow-up, one of the things that they always say is that somebody, a detective or an investigator, going to the actual scene where something happened, it makes such a difference. So when you're doing all this research, you're writing a book about this. I mean, you were investigating it at the deepest levels. As you went into that house, were there certain impressions you had, or did it help to illuminate for you certain things like how this could have happened, or just basically what was it like to be there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the house set wasn't still there, this book probably wouldn't have happened. Again, it was the interest in the house that really that led to the interest in the auction, which led to the story. And if the house wasn't there, it still would be an interesting story, but it wouldn't be as interesting. Again, and just for a marketing standpoint, to be able to say Murder Mansion, it's great. It's supposed to like at 1214 Street or something like that. It was just a house that's gone now. The house is the one of the key figures of the story. So the house is, in terms of the footprint, is very similar to what it was in 1948. It's just some newer additions, and it's been updated. But the Johnsons, the owners, were that's one of the things he does is he preserves old buildings all across the country, and so he was able to preserve the mansion. He didn't like change footprints and modernize it and so forth. So, restored the floors and things like that. You definitely get the sense of this, what this house was like even back in the 40s to a certain extent, even though it's been updated. But the rooms are still there, the same, like I said, the same footprint. But going through it, you don't feel like, oh, this was a house where something horrible happened. It's very nicely decorated and things like that. And the front bedroom where the actual double murder took place, is he had converted it into a billiards room filled with antiques, but it's, bright, and you just don't get that sense. But sometimes if you were there long enough, and as many times as I was, you start thinking about it, it's like, oh, this is kind of weird. There was two people brutally murdered like right there, and we're sitting on the couch having a cup of coffee or whatever, and it was just like 10 feet away. And there was a bullet hole in a staircase, or right above a staircase, there's a picture in the book. That wall is still there. The staircase is still there. The bullet hole is long gone. But if you dug under the, spackle and whatnot on the wall, there probably would be some remnants of some splintered wood or something like that. The door that was shot through, that's long gone, but it's right there. You can see where all this happened. So it definitely, the book, the being in the house, again, not only led to the book, but just being able to be there is something that, again, definitely helped the whole atmosphere. And there's a tour group that was, we've had the tours for 3 years, I think 3 or 4 years. A local organization does a local tour, and they would always, one of their tours was the Murder Mansion tour, and they would wind up on the lawn of Murder Mansion, and I would give a little speech at the end of the tour, and on special nights, and people just loved the fact that they could start the tour at a cemetery nearby, hence the name Cemetery Road, and wind up at Murder Mansion, even if they didn't go in, just to be on the lawn because of this house that they had heard so many great stories about. So yeah, the house is integral to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. It really is. Well, speaking of Cemetery Road, you included another killing in your book that was dubbed the buttermilk killing. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and what was the connection to the other murder? What was the reason for including it?
Sure. Well, the Martins were the owners of the house, the ones who were killed, Dr. Martin and his wife. And they had the house was surrounded at that point by 250 acres of farmland. So they had a lot of tenant farmers, basically, who worked on the farm. And they would come and go. And there's a couple called the Lees, Catherine and Allie Lee, and they had several children. And they worked on the Martin farm at a certain point in the 40s. They had just moved further down Cemetery Road to work at another farm. And that same summer, there was another double killing on Cemetery Road involving the Lees. And so the way I included it, I just thought it was fascinating. People talk about the good old days, and I could tell so many stories and doing a lot of research. There were so much crime and so many murders. I mean, if you look at old newspaper articles or newspaper archives, basically in the 20s, 30s, 40s, pretty much once or twice a week, there would be a murder, double murder, triple murder, and things like that. There was a lot of violence going on, not only in Bowling Green, but I guess all over the place. But I just thought it kind of was interesting that there's this other double murder literally at the same time. A lot of the same cast of characters, the prosecutor, Natcher, the defense attorney, Myers. They were defending Harry Edward Kilgore on the one hand, and then they were also defending the Lees. So Catherine Lee was married to an Allie Lee, and it was an unhappy marriage. And they lived in a little house further down Cemetery Road with Catherine's elderly mother, Kate Goad. And one day, her husband and a neighbor of theirs, Crosland, were having dinner, and then they had some buttermilk, and then they had some whiskey, and next thing you know, they're in convulsing and in pain. Long story short, they were poisoned, and they were both killed. And Catherine Lee was put on trial, as well as her mother, Kate Goad, for they allegedly put strychnine in the buttermilk to kill Allie Lee, and the neighbor was apparently just a side effect. He just happened to be there, wrong place, wrong time. And they were put on trial. The women were, and the first time there was a hung jury, and then they were eventually found guilty. But the conviction was overturned, as a lot of cases were back then. The justice system was much different than it is now. So she was eventually, they were let go. They just didn't find that there was enough evidence, and there's some problem with the evidence. But the prosecutor, William Natcher, later wrote that he believed that Kay Goad was probably the mother or the mother-in-law of Allie was responsible for it because she allegedly had poisoned her first husband, and so she had a history of poisoning men in her life that she wanted to get rid of. She was never convicted or charged with any of those cases other than the Allie Lee case, but she went to her grave with that secret. So it just was kind of an interesting thing that was going on at the same time with some of the same people.
Yeah, and from reading it, I'm with him. I think Grandma did it too.
Oh yeah.
She just seemed like, yeah, so what? I feel like if she'd been interviewed, she reminded me of the Chicago women killers, Belva Gardner, all of them, that they were like, yeah, I did it. And so
yeah.
I thought
Well, it was a different time. It was definitely more, you had to get some strychnine and take care of your problem on your own. And that's what apparently she did. We don't know for sure, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if she was behind it.
Before we go on to analyze this murder mansion case in more detail, your book, by the way, we kept saying this last week, people need to read your book. Just about the time you would think we were coming to a conclusion, there would be a whole new twist and turn, and we'd go off in a new direction. I mean, it just all the way to the end, you kept us going. We left off last week at the point where all the formal charges against George Daggitt had been dropped. But a whole lot more happens after that point, and we're going to ask you to share some of that. So the first question I would ask is, can you tell us what happened with George? Like, how did he live out the rest of his life?
Yeah, tragic tale. You could use a cliche. He was another victim of this whole thing. Juilliard graduate, taught at large universities. He seemed like his career was on the upward trend. So after all this trials and tribulations, where he was finally freed on appeal, Kentucky Court of Appeals, he couldn't get a job back because of the stigma of being associated with all this mess. So he wound up working at an automobile factory in Michigan, and a job that I believe his brother-in-law had procured for him. And so he worked in, a factory basically for most of the rest of his life. And then, again, he went to Juilliard, and just checking the archives, it was one of those fortunate things where Juilliard keeps really good records of their things that have happened. They had a letter that he had written. Juilliard had a placement agency back then, and they helped place their graduates into jobs. And he wrote a letter to Juilliard saying, "Hey, I'd like to get back into music teaching. That's what I've done," and so forth. And the interesting thing about the letter was he kind of glossed over that whole period of time when he was in jail, as you would. And of course, it's the pre-internet days. You could get away with that. How would anyone know? So he just wrote that, yeah, I was at Western, and then decided to take another job at a higher paying job at an automobile factory, and glossed that whole thing over. So he was looking to get back into music at the end of his life there. And he did wind up getting a job teaching music at a middle school, which again, a far cry from where he was. And the only newspaper article I could find about him, and that was and that period when he was eventually exonerated was just like a little snippet saying that he was performing like in a church basement, like performing like some organ music at a church basement or something like that. So obviously his life was, I wouldn't say ruined. We don't know, but obviously took a trajectory that he didn't expect. And again, he went from teaching at universities and being the celebrated musician to teaching middle school band, and then he died of a heart attack in 1965. Very quietly, he had never married, didn't seem to have much family left at that point. So seemed like a tragic end to his life there.
It really was sad. I really felt for him.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Harry Edward Kilgore. When we stopped talking last week, he was still serving out 2 life sentences. So can you share the details behind what we both and our listeners might consider his surprise release? He's out.
Yeah. Yeah, and ironically, but very nicely for the narrative, he was released in 1965, the same year that George Daggitt died.
Yeah.
So what was happening was, he was supposed to be in jail for the rest of his life, but what was happening at that time, so this was in the 60s, was that there was a renewed emphasis on rehabilitation of prisoners, and they thought, well, if somebody has good behavior and we teach them a trade, they could be productive citizens again, rather than just warehousing them. Apparently, he had a few parole hearings. I can't find all the records, but he had apparently a few parole hearings and it was turned down. But eventually, in 1965, maybe no one showed up, is my guess, at the parole hearing to say, don't let this guy go. There wasn't a whole lot of family left, or maybe they thought at that point it's so many years. And he had been learning radio and television repair in jail, and apparently was a model prisoner. And again, there was this sort of new emphasis on rehabilitation. So he went to the parole board and they said, yeah, we'll let you out. The only stipulation was that you had to stay out of Warren County for 5 years and, of course, not commit any other crimes. So that's basically how he got out.
Just a wondering, was he being treated for some mental health issues at that point? Do you think that had anything to do with this being a model prisoner thing?
I don't believe so. Again, I couldn't find any of his prison records other than just some newspaper articles when he was released. But I would think, maybe he underwent some counseling. But even then, in the 60s, I would think was probably pretty rare. So I would think that probably not. Harriet, I know we might touch on this later. He was an interesting guy. He could, a lot of people would think he was insane, but, he had no problem going through life. So, he probably just got by.
Right. He knew how to function in the right setting. You took us both by surprise when you came out with the revelation that you managed to track down Eric Humphreys, the son of Ruth by her next husband, and you got to talk with him. So would you share with us what you learned from him? Because that was such a teaser.
Yeah. So again, going back to the original newspaper articles, I was trying to think of like what we didn't know at the time was, when I started researching, was what had happened to Kilgore and Ruth Martin Humphreys, whatever you want to call her, Ruth. I'll call her Ruth. Whatever happened to them, because there was a lot of rumors that they had gotten married, that she was in on it and so forth, and like whatever happened to Kilgore and to Ruth, we just didn't know. Again, sort of a behind the scenes thing, when you're doing research and you don't know a lot and you're typing in Ruth Martin and she was a certain age, you will get thousands and thousands and thousands of obituaries, newspaper articles. It's like, how do you track down whatever happened to Ruth? I don't know. You Google search, and there was a lot of people named Ruth Martin in the U.S. back then, especially. So we just couldn't figure out what had happened to her, what had happened to Harry. Really, it was one of those things where I saw like somewhere online, maybe it was like Find a Grave or something like that, where somebody had posted something about one of the Martins. I'm not sure. I can't even recall right now. But anyway, it was a long chain, and I saw somebody had posted something, and it's like, oh, this person might know something, and I contacted them just out of the blue, and they're like, well, no, I'm a genealogist in Florida, and there's some long distant family connection. And so she tracked down the fact that, oh, well, Ruth had remarried and her name was Humphreys. and they had three sons. And so I kind of blindly reached out to the first one I think I could find on Facebook, which was Eric, and explained what I was doing. It was kind of interesting because he had just discovered maybe a year or two ago the whole story himself, because they didn't know. It was, again, there was not a whole lot of stuff on the internet even at this point about the case. So he knew Harry Edward Kilgore basically as sort of a stepfather, but he was able to clear things up. So he was able to say that yes, Ruth did get back together, although they never formally married. Ruth and Harry got together, lived as husband and wife for many years, the remainder of their lives in Florida and in Bowling Green. They went back and forth. And so he was able to shed a whole bunch of light on, again, what had eventually happened to Ruth and what eventually happened to Harry, which make up, the bulk of the second half of the book, because no one had known that that's really what had happened.
Yeah. Why do you think that he was so willing to talk about his mom and her involvement with him?
I don't know. Doing this a long time, you just never know. Some people, you think, unfortunately, part of the job is reaching out to people who've had tragic things happen to them. Some people want to talk about it. Some people don't want to talk about it. Some people find it, I guess, cathartic. I don't know. But he was willing. I almost got a sense that he was still a little bit in shock because, again, he had just maybe found out a year or two ago that his what he called his stepfather was and what he had done. He had no idea. He was willing to talk about it, and of course, doing my due diligence, I'm like, well, I'd love to talk to your other family members or your brothers. And he said the rest of the family, this is an embarrassment for them, or it's too shocking for them, whatever. And they had no interest in talking. So I was lucky that I got Eric Humphreys to talk when he did, because I haven't talked to him for a while. I don't know what his reaction would be now. I haven't actually spoken to him since the book came out, so I don't know what his reaction is either. But he was just, he was able to clear things up. And, for whatever reason, again, I almost felt like he was a little bit still in shock of learning what had happened and who Harry Edward Kilgore really was.
Did he have a reaction to the book?
I hadn't heard from him, so I assume he read it, but I hadn't heard. Like I said, it might have been like something, hopefully, that maybe gave it some closure to the whole family, because now it's like, the word, everyone knows the reality of it and so forth, and the rumors can stop because now we know really what happened. So I'm not sure, but I can imagine that that's not something you want to keep revisiting. I don't know.
Did you get the impression? I'm just wondering, there was one comment where you said, I believe if I remember correctly, that Eric said his mom wasn't very nurturing and was a little self-centered. Did you get the impression that they had kind of ended on good terms, or do you feel like there was some estrangement there?
Yeah, it definitely seemed like there wasn't the best relationship from her. And I actually talked to some other people. Not all of it made it to the book because it was kind of secondhand, things like that. But you definitely got the sense that Ruth was very aloof and very different. Also, she had dementia for the good part of the rest of the end of her life. So it's not something that. So when they found out that, hey, Harry Edward Kilgore, had done these things, they couldn't like say, hey, mom, why didn't you tell us, or things like that, because she was already, in the throes of dementia. It was kind of a lot of unresolved, I think, issues there with her.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back to Ruth in a little bit because we want to ask you more about her. We were really taken with, we had a lot of questions about Ruth, but we'd like to kind of now go back and talk about a few of the details about the case, work our way through just a little bit. So I'm going to go back to the night of the murders, because this may be something, I don't know. It just struck me. It may be nothing, but it made me wonder. The morning that the Martin murders were discovered, you wrote that the painter, Joe Emerson, just came in the back of their house through the back door when he arrived. Even though nobody was there, nobody let him in. He didn't talk to anybody. And that struck me. And I know it was a different time period, though. It was 1948. So was that, do you think, indicative of just the way home security was at the time, or was there something else going on there with that situation?
No, I think it was just the way it was at that point. There was a lot of, again, there were tenant farmers, so they were coming and going. The house, again, at that point was on the outskirts of the city. Wouldn't be surprised if they didn't really lock their doors, maybe just a little latch, which we have some testimony that there was a latch on the screen door in the back. So, and he had a job to do, and it's probably everyone knew everybody. And so I think it was just a sign of the times. I live in the neighborhood that was part of the farm. So it's like Murder Mansion is about not even a mile up the road from my house then. So, and I've been living here for almost 20 years, and it's like, even I can remember like a lot of people don't close their doors, don't lock their doors 15 years ago, even here in Bowling Green, this area. So it was, I think it was just the way it was, safe, and you didn't expect anything. And he had the reason to be there, which was, he was doing this painting job and he left his paints and so forth. So yeah, I think it was just, again, just the way it was at that time.
I have a question about back to Harry Edward Kilgore. We call him both Harry and Edward. The question of his sanity was pretty important to his trial, and also when he was testifying against George, he kind of went back and forth on whether he was or wasn't, and he kind of acted like he was, and then he acted like he was fine. What is your opinion on what his sanity or insanity was? Just your opinion.
Yeah, well, that's one of my favorite parts of the book because of the introduction, and I won't digress too long, but Professor Manfred Guttmacher, who I'd never heard of, but such a fascinating character. And again, it's like from a movie, this guy, this brilliant doctor, and so forth, and um, coming in and saying, "Yeah, I'll testify if you pay me enough," and normally he wouldn't be paid. They wouldn't be able to afford him, but Stony Martin saying, "I'll pay whatever you need." So he comes in and so forth. Fascinating character. I thought that there certainly would be a book about Guttmacher, but there wasn't. Just a side note, there's a Guttmacher Institute that you hear about in the news very often. That's his brother was the founder of that Guttmacher Institute. So it's the same family. I guess there's different definitions of insane and so forth. In terms of a legal perspective, the criteria is generally something like, do you know the difference between right or wrong? Do you know your actions were wrong? I think clearly he knew what he was doing was wrong. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But was there something, whatever the diagnosis would be, if was there something off about him? Yes, but what it is, very hard to tell at this point. But I would say from like I said, a legal standpoint, I do think he would be if it happened today, he would stand trial, because I do think he knows, sort of that litmus test of, does he know the difference between right and wrong, the consequences of his actions. I think he clearly did know that. But was there something different about him? For sure. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Candy and I both do theater. And so when we were reading about his antics, I was just like, come on. I know you just talked about how you did a play. This is clearly you're playing this up. Growing his hair long, doing the broom thing, holding the book upside down. I was like, that's too far. You've gone too far. That was a move too far if you're trying to prove that you're insane, to me.
Yeah, and there's also testimony about how brilliant he was, and so there's no doubt that he could be playing people and knew how to do that. It'd be such a fascinating person to get to talk to, or if there was ever an interview for him. There are some indications that in his later life he was even more unusual than he was in his younger life. No doubt he was brilliant. I mean, he was studying physics and a star student, and able to do a lot of different things, and so, brilliant but troubled. What the diagnosis would be, I don't know, but yeah, very interesting. But again, from a legal standpoint, I would say, in a broad sense of the term, I don't think he was insane or crazy, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just as a side note, we mentioned this in last week's episode that we got so excited when we saw Rhodes Myers because of the connection to the Dark Highway case that we covered last year. When we saw that the one attorney said Rhodes Myers told him what to do and he did it, that was clearly this ploy that they had set out to make him look crazy. I was like, goodness. But this is just a side note. Ella, his mom, when she would be testifying, trying to say that he was insane, she would give one testimony, and then later she'd come back when they didn't want him to be insane, and her testimony would be totally different.
Right.
Were you not held accountable for your testimony under oath back then? How could you do that?
There are a lot of shocking things about reading about the going in depth into the cases and trials and so forth. It was much more, I guess you could say, loosey goosey back then. Attorneys who are not prosecutors or defense attorneys taking part and asking questions and being there and sitting, and like people speaking from the peanut gallery and saying things. And, it was just more of a, I think more of an anything goes. Back then, perjury obviously was a crime. And could you make a case? Probably. But, I'm sure there was just, they were going for the bigger fish as opposed to something like, oh, we're going to try to get around perjury or something like that. And there was enough vacillating in her answers that they couldn't, it wasn't like she said X happened and then Y happened. She was more saying like, oh, he was fine. Oh no, he was never right. So I would think that would be hard to bring a perjury case against that. But yeah, it was just a more loosey goosey, probably a better word for it. But anything goes kind of a time, I think, back then.
Right. Well, back to Ruth. So at one point in testifying against George, Edward claimed that he had told Ruth of his plans to murder the Martins, which would be her in-laws, but that she didn't believe him, and he maintained that she had no role in those killings at all. But years later, if I captured this correctly from your book, attorney William Natcher wrote in his private journal, quote, Ruth knew that I knew she was much more involved than could be substantiated with proper evidence which could be accepted in court. All during the trial of the Kilgore case, she just sat and glared at me. So we would love to know your personal opinion about how much Ruth knew or how much she might have been involved.
I think I wouldn't be surprised if Harry Edward Kilgore had said something along those lines. It's like, wouldn't it be great if we got rid of, the Martins and we could all live in the house and be together again or something like that. I don't think she was in on it in terms of like planning things like that. It wouldn't make sense from a whole bunch of reasons. Was something said potentially? Did she have a reason to believe that he was serious? No, there's nothing that would make I think her think that, oh yes, this is probably going to happen. But Ruth was somewhat naive, I think it sounds like, from everyone who's known her, talked about. But I think even she would know that a plan like that, if we were to believe Harry Edward Kilgore, that the plan is to kill the Martins, and then when they get back from a honeymoon, we're going to kill Stoney, and then the three of us, Daggitt, Kilgore, and Ruth, all live happily ever after in this mansion with all the Martin money. I think even a naive 18-year-old woman like Ruth at that point wouldn't say, "Oh, let's do it. That sounds like a good plan." So I don't think she was involved on any sort of a deep level. Maybe she had heard something, or she knew that Harry was trouble, maybe, but I don't believe she was part of the planning process or knew for sure that this was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the marriage between her and Stoney? Why did it happen? How did it happen? It seemed to be very quick. Do you have any opinion on this?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, as outlined in the book, she had a lot of suitors. She was a beautiful young lady, a lot of men interested in her. For her to marry somebody more than twice her age. She was 18, and I believe Stoney was 52 at the time. Described as a hunchback, so he had some physical deformity. Kind of a recluse, apparently. Why of all the suitors would you marry somebody like that unless they had all this money? That obviously was one of the reasons that it was looked upon suspiciously that she had to be involved in this, right? Because like, well, why else would you have married Stoney unless you knew that this plan was in place? It's hard to say exactly why they got married. I will say two things though on her behalf. One, she stayed married to him until he died. Which was just a few years later because he was in bad health, but she didn't leave him. Again, she was always described as somebody who depended on men to take care of her. She never really, even in her later years, she never really had a career and things like that. And again, this is sort of the speculation about why she got back again with Harry. She was just looking for somebody to take care of her. Well, Stoney was in a better position to take care of her than the 20-year-old college sophomore, or whatever, the guy who was trying to hit on her at a restaurant, or what the guy she would meet in church. Stoney was apparently kind-hearted, and was going to be able to take care of them. They were kind of neighbors, so she maybe have known the family a little bit. That speaks to that maybe she was just looking for someone to take care of her, and Stoney happened to be, the guy that she picked. And she stayed with him until he passed. So that indicates that maybe she just, for whatever reason, she was sincere in wanting to marry Stoney and be with him.
So following up with that, sometime between that wedding to Ruth and the start of George's first trial, Stoney files a will. He names Ruth as beneficiary, which is expected, but he puts down a stipulation that if she remarries, she loses everything. Right. So if she's the person that wants to be taken care of, you would think that she would just never remarry, but then she does remarry. First of all, how do you interpret Stoney's action? Do you think that he's kind of going, I don't know if you're involved in this or not, but I'm going to put down these parameters. If you were involved, then you're not going to get my money. And then why didn't she remarry?
Right. So that's the thing. There was no doubt. We kind of talked about William Natcher saying, "Oh, we knew that she was involved, and we knew she knew that we knew," and so forth. The rumors again were already going around that why would Ruth marry Stoney, and and then when the murders happened, well, obviously she was after the money. So Stoney would have heard all of these things and probably been told and been pulled aside even by William Natcher more than likely and said, hey, you need to watch yourself. So I definitely think the will was an insurance policy saying, if this is true, you're not getting anything. A lot of the questions I get in doing the tours and the book events and so forth is about Ruth and whether she was involved or not. And again, that's a big reason why I think maybe she wasn't, or the evidence kind of shows that she wasn't, because again, as you said, the will said you get everything, and she did. He died. She had the house. She never had to work a day in her life. She had everything she could need materially. But she met this Stan Humphreys, and wound up marrying him. And she didn't have to, even though the rumor was that she was pregnant. But even if she was pregnant, there would have been stigma at the time of being an unwed mother or whatever. But who cares? You're living a life of luxury in this beautiful mansion, and you could be with this gentleman without getting married and have a child out of wedlock. I mean, it happened. It happened even back then, obviously. So she didn't have to get married, but she got married and she gave it all up. And that's the period when the house became empty because per Stoney's will, the house and all the property went to the International Order of Oddfellows chapter. They had it for several years. They were going to make an orphanage out of Murder Mansion. For whatever reason, they didn't. And eventually they wound up selling everything. But and again, that was the period when it became known as the haunted house of Bowling Green and so forth. But she gave it all up. She gave it all up to live with a middle-class guy. And of course, it didn't even work out. They had 3 sons, but then they eventually got divorced. So that's another indication that Ruth was somewhat of an innocent victim in all this, because again, if she really wanted all the money and the wealth and so forth, she had it and she gave it up.
In the book, there was talk of this extortion scheme. It involved the Western Kentucky University professor, Olga Eitner. What is your opinion about the true story behind that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the clearer things that we know that George Daggitt did that seems unsavory. We're pretty sure that he was involved in it. So Olga Eitner was another really interesting character. I had never heard of her, as most people would have heard of her, but doing some research, she was a nationally known child prodigy on the violin. And like going back to the early 1900s, as a child, she would play violin with the Chicago Symphony and all over the country and things like that. And as an adult, she was a violin teacher, and she wound up being a violin teacher at Western Kentucky University, working with George Daggitt. And there's, yes, a very bizarre story, and there's various versions of it. The short version of it is that basically they got Harry and Daggitt figure out a way to get some compromising pictures of Olga with a traveling shoe salesman, which were, of course, common at that time. And they blackmailed her. And Olga apparently fair amount of money. They said, if you don't give us X amount of money and your car, whatever it was, then we'll send these photos to the Western professor or your father back home. And I think it was Oklahoma or something like that. And she apparently did give them a fair, a substantial sum of money and her car and things like that. There's also rumors that they might have dog napped her dog. She had like a beloved dog and things like that. It's a very bizarre case, but it became part of the trial because the prosecutors wanted to show evidence that, hey, these two guys were involved in criminal activity. And George Daggitt was short of money for sure. He was taking care of his invalid mother, paying all her medical bills. She had some surgery and so forth, and he was living in a very modest apartment. The apartment complex is still here in Bowling Green, actually. It's mostly occupied by students, like in a small apartment. He wasn't making a whole lot of money. He had all these medical bills. So there's no doubt that he needed money. He was borrowing money. He borrowed money from Kilgore's mother and things like that. So there doesn't seem too much of a doubt that they did do this weird, this weird extortion scheme against Olga Eitner. Again, they were never prosecuted for it. The details didn't really come out until the trial. And then, doing some research on Olga Eitner, whatever happened to her, she apparently, this traumatized her, and she went, I think, out to Texas, got remarried. They wanted to bring her back for the trial, and she wouldn't. And again, everything was sort of more loosey-goosey back then. They, could have compelled her theoretically, but they didn't really want to. So, it's just one of those weird, like, almost sounds too bizarre to be true, the traveling shoe salesman, extortion, dog napping, and things like that. But it's part of actually what happened back then.
It's so interesting to hear your opinion about that, because I have to say you did such a good job of being that objective journalist who just sticks to the evidence and the facts, that George to me was painted as such an innocent sounding person until we got to the point to where it said the attorneys say that he admitted he did that. And then all of a sudden it was like George became a different person to me, because he had not sounded like somebody who would have done anything criminal or really unethical, because she was a friend, right? Like that was a really heinous thing to do, period. But even more so, they had a relationship. Am I correct in that?
Well, they were acquaintances. I don't think there was anything beyond that, or they knew each other fairly well. But yeah, friends. I would guess you'd call them friends. But yeah, it's he definitely. So in terms of the murder, you can talk about that in terms of what a travesty of justice that was and why it happened. But did he do bad things in his life? Yeah, certainly. I guess that would be the prime example of being desperate and needing the money and coming up, whether he came up with it or Kilgore came up with it, being part of this very bizarre extortion scheme.
Just wildly out of character.
Yeah, I guess desperate times.
Yeah.
Well, that leads us directly then into the next question. So then, do you believe that George was an accomplice in the murders? How do you think it actually happened?
Yeah, I don't think he was an came up with this idea because, again, same thing with Ruth. I don't think he might not have been the most street smart person in the world, but he was definitely an intelligent person. And again, to think that the plan is, oh, we'll kill the Martins and then we'll kill Stoney, and then the three of us, this odd couple, whatever three people are called, thruple, I guess, would live happily ever after in this house, and no one would be the wiser, and no one would question it. That doesn't make sense. And Daggett would have known that it didn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, could there have been some sort of version of that where we take the money and we go to Mexico or something like that? Well, who knows? But the only evidence against Daggett being involved in the crime, the murders, is the testimony of Harry Edward Kilgore. And Harry Edward Kilgore changed his version of events over and over and over and over and over again to suit him, basically to deflect some of the blame from himself. The attorney, the great attorney who successfully had the conviction overturned in the Court of Appeals, he called it the voice of madness. That Harry Edward Kilgore spoke in the voice of madness, and how can a jury take the voice of madness and say, yes, that's evidence? Mm-hmm. I don't think that there's any doubt that, again, today, that there wouldn't have been a prosecution based on just this one testimony of this person that the state is, is conceded as a liar and a troubled person and a murderer that a lot of people would say was mentally ill, and say, oh yeah, so we're going to take his word for it and prosecute somebody. I think there's no doubt, again, that as the attorney kind of pointed out, that it was a verdict of prejudice. There was a lot of rumors and speculation that Harry and George were romantically involved, and the prosecutor would always bring that up. It's like this was an unnatural relationship. It was they professed love for each other, and of course, what could that mean except that they were engaged in a romantic relationship? And I think that's why the case was bought, and I think that's why the case was overturned. And again, there was a very powerful piece of testimony when that was presented again in the appeal, that the jurors, who were mostly just rural farmers from Warren County, they only asked the judge one question. They said, "Could you tell us what homosexual means?" Because the term wasn't as popular back then or well known back then, and that was the only question they had for the judge. And so the Court of Appeals rightly said, well, this is obviously, and the judge rightly didn't answer that question, said, just go debate the facts. There was no basis for this verdict. So legally, yes, he shouldn't have been prosecuted. I don't think there's any question about that. And again, for the reasons we talked about, I don't believe that he was in on it. Again, was he listening to Harry Edward Kilgore fantasize about different things? Yes. Was he maybe egging him on and maybe not doing the best job in terms of like trying to steer him clear of these things? Or were they in a relationship? I don't know. None of those things we'll ever know, unfortunately. But from a legal standpoint, I don't think there was any doubt that he was not an accomplice and that he shouldn't have been brought to trial. Again, there was just not enough evidence to bring him to trial. It kind of ruined his life either way. Even though he didn't spend the rest of his life in jail, he was never able to really reclaim his career.
It ruined both of their lives.
Yeah. Pretty much everyone involved except Harry and Ruth, lived a relatively normal life there, for the rest of their lives. But again, this was pre-internet days. I think a lot of people were shocked to find out that Harry and Ruth were living in their midst, in the 70s, early 80s. People had no idea,
It fascinates me that she got back together with him.
I know.
Well, and that's another reason. So the argument that she was involved, a lot of people will point to that. Again, these are a lot of discussions I've had since the book has come out and doing the tours and so forth. They're like, well, she wouldn't have gotten back together with him if she wasn't involved. And again, though, I point to two things. One, that she had a history of relying on men to take care of her, and here was Harry willing to take care of her. But the second thing was, again, she had all these suitors. Again, the police had the names of like dozens of suitors and so forth. And so, these guys were like buying her flowers and buying her chocolates. Where Harry Edward Kilgore killed two people for her. So maybe she was like, wow, he really does love me and he really does care for me and really would do for anything for me, which sounds weird, except that, again, all the stories we hear about Ruth just being so dependent and so codependent on men in her life. Maybe she was flattered by it and felt that, gosh, he proved himself to me, and that's why they got back together. So again, I don't think that necessarily proves that she was in on it. It just shows that maybe Ruth was an unusual person.
Yeah, that's a good word. Very unusual. Well, do you have any current projects that you would like to mention, or how can our listeners follow you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Just my name, Wes at Wes Swietek, WES SWIETEK. And then at the Bowling Green Daily News, I do a regular feature called Histories and Mysteries, really spurred by this the Murder Mansion story because it's been so popular. Found out that our readers really love either true crime or just a historical piece, the things that people maybe don't know about in terms of had happened in South Central Kentucky. So it's not a regular feature, but I try to do 3 or 4 of those a year, and those can all be found at bgdailynews.com. And then I am working on another project which should be out from Acclaim Press, the same publisher. Don't have a date yet, but it'll be 2025. And it's basically on the true crime era of the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s in Bowling Green, when Bowling Green was known as Little Chicago and allegedly had the highest per capita murder rate in the country. And there was crime rings and all sorts of bizarre goings on. where yeah, you basically had people putting signs, by the riverfront saying, "Please don't dump any more bodies in the river" and things like that. So that's to be TBD, but that's I'm working on that right now. It should be out in 2025.
Oh, cool. Well, we'll definitely read it.
Yes, I will say that was one of the things I commented upon with your book. Being a Western student, a former Western student, your background, your history, and your flavor of Bowling Green, it was lovely. After reading your book, I just had to go visit again. So I can see you doing such a lovely job with another true crime incident set in Bowling Green. That'll be fascinating.
Yeah, it's everyone knows the Little Chicago era. The people have been here for a long time, and so it's to delve into that is really interesting because it's not what people think. So
Ooh,
yeah, a little teaser there.
Nice.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. This has been wonderful. You've answered so many questions that have been burning in our minds for the last few weeks. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was amazing. What
Yes.
are a few of your thoughts, Ashley?
My biggest thing, as you know, is I wanted to know more about Ruth.
Mhm.
So one thing that had never crossed my mind is something that he told us toward the very end of the interview, which is that, okay, why did she get back together with him? Well, Harry had kind of proven himself. Now we're not saying that's what her reason was. We don't know, but it kind of clicked in my head and went, wow, although that is wild and not something that we would think of, maybe in her mind that made sense. Because she, if she really needed someone to take care of her, although I would go, why in the world would you trust Harry to take care of you? But she needed that. And he had proven himself like, I will do anything for you. So she trusted
Mhm.
him with her,
Mhm.
with herself, you know?
I thought that was an interesting point too. And what he made me wonder is between her son saying that she wasn't nurturing and calling herself centered, and then she suffered with dementia for the last 20 years of her life, it kind of made me wonder where she was with her mental health. And maybe there were some things going on that we don't know about.
Right.
But I felt like it was really, I just always love to hear the opinions of somebody who knows this story inside and out. And it was so interesting for me to hear him say, no, he did not think she was involved, because I wanted to know, did he think she was involved? It
Yeah.
was interesting to hear that opinion that, he did not think she was. And then, boy, have I changed my stance on George since.
Okay. What do you think? What's your new stance?
I was reading the book, and he did such a good job of being objective that I kept going, I think George is innocent. And
Yeah.
then when it said that whole extortion piece, all of a sudden I was like, if a person would do this, now I'm not making as big a leap to consider that he might have done this, yet there wasn't any evidence
Yeah.
against him. I am now solidly in the camp that Wes that Wes has staked out. I think he is right. I don't think George was the good person that I hoped he was for most of the book. I think George probably had plenty of flaws and the potential for doing some really bad things. And maybe he did even egg Edward on or not stop him from doing something bad, but I don't believe he was there. I think
Yeah.
the story just changed too much and there was no evidence to
Yeah.
support it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that I don't remember, but I don't think that I thought that he was there in the first place. But my opinion was that I didn't really remember the part about him admitting to the extortion. And so hearing Wes confirm it and say, "Yeah, I did that part." Like you said, it just sort of brought him down, his character down in my estimation because to me, well, it was clear reading it. It's clear that he couldn't have had anything to do with this. He's taking care of his mother. He's a sweet man. He's all of this, which I guess you can be those things and still be a criminal. But it just felt like this is not something that our George would do. And
It's awful. What he did to that woman, what they did to that woman was awful. So unethical and so wrong. And so that was not who I had created in my mind. Because you're right. When you hear somebody who is assuming his mother's debt, who has moved in to
yeah,
take care of his mother, who's got a, debilitating medical condition, you have a different image in your mind of this
yeah,
man. Yeah.
yes. But now let's hop on to the positive. Wes was delightful. I
Oh
love
yes.
him. I cannot wait to read his new book.
Oh,
It
I know. I
It
know.
reminded me of our Beverly Hills Supper Club episode where there was I ended up reading the book that the gentleman, I can't remember his name now, but we talked about it in there where a person had investigated the supper club and he investigated like the mob ties and all that. And you know how I am. I read it and I was like, I believe him. I'm in it 100%. But it reminded me of that. I'm like, ooh, what if these two things are connected? So we may have to have Wes back after he puts out his next book, because I can already tell we're going to be fascinated, or I am. I know I'm going to be fascinated.
Absolutely. And I also want to look up his series. I can't remember the title, but those little mysteries.
Histories and Mysteries, I think, is what he said.
Nice. Yeah, I'm going to definitely check into those too. So a huge thank you to Mr. Wes Swietek. That was amazing. And a big cheers to you.
Cheers.
If you love what we do, please rate and review our show. Or you can become a supporter by making a donation through buymeacoffee.com/scandalwaterpod. Whether a single gift or a recurring monthly donation, it would go a long way towards supporting our work and allowing us to keep the tea brewing.
At our website, www.scandalwaterpodcast.com, you can submit questions or your own story ideas, access our sources and show notes, see the merch we offer for sale, and more. You can join the Scandal Water community through our Scandal Water Podcast Facebook page, or follow us on Instagram or TikTok at Scandal Water Podcast.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown,
that's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music. Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.